One of the first tasks to decide in the project delivery phase is if you need to hire a consultant to provide engineering services. To hire a consultant, you must use what is called Qualification-Based Selection, or QBS. This is also referred to as the Brooks Act and is a federal regulation and is not a new law and has been around since the 70s. An LPA cannot bypass QBS by using local funds to hire a consultant. This is not allowed because Missouri also has a regulation that mirrors the federal law and is commonly referred to as the Mini Brooks Act. Watch this brief 2-minute video developed by the Federal Highway Administration on consultant services and federal law.
Competitive negotiation procedures generally apply when the engineering and design-related services you need directly relate to a construction project. We commonly refer to these as qualifications-based selection procedures. The requirements that apply to competitive negotiation procedures are defined within a federal law known as the Brooks Act. Unlike low-bid contracting, the Brooks Act requires the selection of a consultant based on its qualifications to provide the needed services. The Brooks Act also requires basing the contract amount on a fair and reasonable cost that is negotiated by the agency and the selected firm. Under competitive negotiation procedures, the goal is to determine and agree to contract terms for fair and reasonable compensation, considering the scope and complexity of the work. Agencies are required to develop an independent cost estimate to serve as a basis for negotiations with the selected consultant. One item that cannot be negotiated is the consulting firm's indirect cost rates. These rates are either established by or submitted to a federal agency or state DOT for approval of compliance with the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR, cost principles. FAR is the principal set of requirements used to determine allowable costs on consultant service contracts when federal funds are used. An accepted and approved indirect cost rate must be used for purposes of contract estimation, negotiation, and administration, and it cannot be negotiated or arbitrarily capped. You may need to contact your state DOT to verify that any indirect cost rate a consultant proposed is in compliance with the FAR cost principles. Small purchase procedures are relatively simple and less formal than competitive negotiation procedures, and the specific requirements will vary from state to state. These procedures apply when total contract costs will not exceed the federal simplified acquisition threshold of $150,000. If a state has an established threshold lower than the federal $150,000 threshold, the lower state threshold will apply to the use of federal aid funds. If the total contract costs are below the established threshold, applicable state small purchase procedures may be used to procure engineering and design-related consultant services. Non-competitive procurement refers to situations where the use of a competitive process is not feasible. This method may be used in limited circumstances where the service is available only from a single source, an emergency exists, or where competition is determined to be inadequate after a solicitation has been made. You must obtain approval from FHWA for each use of this procurement method. Remember, competitive negotiation, small purchase, or non-competitive procedures apply to engineering or design-related consultant services that directly relate to the construction of a project. If your needed consultant services are not determined to be engineering or design-related, then simply follow your state or local procedural requirements. Once an agreement is executed, the consultant's work must be monitored for the life of the contract for services. Agencies must be adequately staffed to oversee this work, and at a minimum must provide at least one full-time agency employee in responsible charge of the consultant's work. The agency should monitor the consultant's work for quality and completeness, and invoices must be consistent with the contract terms and the FAR cost principles. When a consultant services contract is completed, you are required to evaluate the consultant's performance of the contract scope of work. This evaluation should be retained and used in the assessment of past performance of the consultant when competing for future work. All records pertaining to your federal aid consultant services contract are required to be kept on file a minimum of 3 years following submittal of your final voucher to FHWA by your state DOT. Record retention will help you demonstrate compliance with all requirements just covered.
Any agency that uses federal aid funds to hire consultants for engineering and design-related services accepts the responsibility to follow the requirements just outlined. Make sure to establish and follow written policies and procedures that detail how a consultant is hired and how the subsequent contract will be administered and monitored. Each state DOT has the oversight responsibility for consultant services procurement and administration activities in that state. As such, the state DOT can help answer any questions prior to contracting with a consultant using federal aid funds, so you can meet all applicable federal and state laws and regulations.
There are 3 ways to design an LPA project. Option 1 is work by local forces, or WBLF. The second option is using a consultant from the on-call consultant list. And the third option is the standard process known as the Qualification-Based Selection, or QBS. From the video you just watched, it was stated that the LPAs must use a competitive procurement procedure commonly known as Qualification-Based Selection, or the Brooks Act. That is true for options 2 and 3. Option 1, however, is using staff of the local agency and not hiring an outside consultant or engineer. Therefore, the Brooks Act does not apply to this particular situation. Now let's take a closer look at all 3 options. The first way to hire a consultant is using a city employee. This is known as work by local forces, or WBLF. The engineer must be a city employee on the city payroll and must be a licensed professional engineer in the state of Missouri. The engineer cannot be a consulting firm hired as a city engineer. If you have a city engineer on staff, you can utilize them to perform this in-house design work. For more information on how to get in-house design approval from MoDOT, visit the LPA Manual section 136.3.12. This chapter of the manual spells out the eligible costs and activities, submittal requirements, and procedures for getting in-house design approval. It should be noted that if this option is used, there is no need to develop a request for qualifications, or RFQ, and advertise, as this work would be done in-house. The second option for hiring a consultant is utilizing the LPA on-call consultant list. This list was developed by Missouri's Local Program Advisory Panel and MoDOT and was overseen by the Federal Highway Administration and American Council of Engineering Companies, ACEC Missouri. This assembled team utilized qualification-based selection procedures to develop the on-call list for local agencies to utilize. There are 5 work categories established within the on-call list. They are Traffic and Traffic Engineering Assistance Program, or TEAP, Structures, Roadway, Trails and Sidewalks, and Construction Inspection. By using this on-call option, the local agency will not have to develop an RFQ or advertise for the work. Essentially, the advertisement has already been completed for the local agency when the on-call list was developed. Now let's go over the process on how to use the LPA on-call consultant list. First, you will need to prepare a scope of work the consultant will perform. Next, you will need to prepare an independent cost estimate of the engineering work. If the engineering work on the project will be less than $100,000, you will be eligible to choose a consultant from the on-call list in the appropriate category and start negotiations with that firm. It's very important to note that if the engineering work is greater than $100,000, the local agency must either perform the work in-house or hire a consultant using option number 3, qualification-based selection. Now you might ask, which category does the LPA choose from? There are 5 categories as mentioned earlier. Let's say, for example, you have a bridge replacement project and you want the consultant to design the bridge. In this case, you must choose a consultant from the structures category on the on-call list. Now let's say you have the same project but want the consultant to design and inspect the bridge replacement. In this case, the consultant must be in both structures and construction inspection categories to be considered for this work. The on-call list can be found on the LPA website. The on-call list is an optional tool and does not have to be used. You can always use the standard process, which will be outlined next. The third option for hiring a consultant is Qualification-Based Selection, QBS, which is known as the standard process. Watch this 9.5-minute video developed by the Federal Highway Administration on qualification-based selection.
In many cases, as buyers in both our professional and private lives, we assume that most service providers are essentially the same, and it is appropriate to choose the lowest cost option. However, when we require the professional medical services of a surgeon, for example, the cheapest option may not be our first choice. In this case, qualifications and experience become more important than the lowest price. The same is true for selecting consultants to engineer and design your highway construction projects using federal aid funds. As the local public agency, or LPA, when you need to hire a consultant for engineering and design-related services using federal aid funds, you must follow federal requirements for competitive negotiation procurement procedures, unless your State Department of Transportation or State DOT allows alternate procedures for lower-cost contract amounts. The Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA, defines engineering and design-related services as program management, construction management, preliminary engineering, design, surveying and mapping, and architectural-related services. If your state provides a broader definition of engineering services in law or regulation for you to follow, these additional services are also subject to federal requirements. The foundation for competitive negotiation procurement requirements is the Brooks Act. The Brooks Act is a federal law that establishes the qualifications-based selection requirements for procuring engineering and design-related services. The process for hiring a consultant under the Brooks Act and competitive negotiation procurement requirements can be broken down to 3 simple steps. Issuing a request for proposal, or RFP, to publicly solicit the need and requirements for services. Selecting a consultant based on qualifications to provide the needed engineering services, and negotiating fair and reasonable cost and contract terms with the selected consultant. Before you hire a consultant, you must first detail how your agency will administer this process by establishing written procedures, unless your state prescribes the procedure for you to use. When you develop your own written procedures, your state DOT must approve them before they are permitted to be used on federal aid projects. Let's take a closer look at some of the required steps of the competitive negotiation procurement process. The first step in hiring a consultant involves issuing a request for proposals. Just as hiring a contractor requires a set of plans, specifications, and construction documents for soliciting bids, hiring a consultant starts with developing a request for proposal, or RFP. Your RFP must clearly detail the scope of work, qualifications, responsibilities, and deliverables that you seek from a consultant. The RFP must detail the estimated schedule for the performance and delivery of the services and the method of contract payment. Your RFP must clearly define the evaluation criteria used to assess and rate the qualifications of responding consultant firms, along with the scoring weight for each of the assigned criteria. The evaluation criteria must relate to the qualifications needed to provide the advertised scope of work and services. The qualifications-based evaluation criteria listed in your RFP may include, but are not necessarily limited to, the qualifications of staff, prior similar work experience, past performance, workload capacity, and technical project approach. Federal requirements prohibit the use of in-state or local hiring preferences and do not allow you to consider price or any element of cost in the evaluation, ranking, and selection of the most highly qualified consultant. Like other solicitations, the RFP to hire a consultant must be advertised for a sufficient amount of time in order to solicit proposals from as many qualified consultants as possible. You must allow fair and open competition by providing equal opportunity for in-state and out-of-state consultants to compete. Check with your state DOT to make sure you meet all requirements for advertising the RFP in your state. The second step begins after the close of the advertisement period. All submitted proposals are evaluated and ranked according to the evaluation criteria and scoring basis outlined in the RFP. List in order of preference at least 3 consultants you determine to be the most qualified. As you prepare for negotiations, you must develop an independent cost estimate that reflects the advertised scope of work. This estimate is used as the basis for negotiation with the selected consultant. Now you may begin the third step of negotiating cost and contract terms with the number 1 ranked most highly qualified consultant. Your negotiations should focus on the level of effort and experience of staff required to complete the scope of work and perform the needed tasks. Only tasks included within the scope of work advertised in the RFP may be incorporated into the selected consultant's contract. Ultimately, you are required to determine and agree to contract terms for fair and reasonable compensation, considering the scope and complexity of the needed work. The cost principles of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or FAR, are the set of rules that govern the costs of goods and services using federal funds. You are required to ensure compliance with the FAR cost principles for determining allowable costs on consultant services contracts when federal funds are used. These costs include those directly associated with a specific contract, as well as a consultant's overhead costs, which are formally referred to as their indirect cost rate. Each consultant is required to annually establish their indirect cost rate in compliance with the FAR cost principles. A consultant's indirect cost rate can only be approved for use by either a federal agency or state DOT. Once approved, the consultant's indirect cost rate must be used for purposes of estimating, negotiating, and making payment on the contract. As the LPA, you are not permitted to negotiate or arbitrarily cap a FAR-compliant indirect cost rate. Contact your state DOT to verify that any proposed indirect cost rate is in compliance with the FAR cost principles. In some situations, negotiations may break down if a satisfactory contract cannot be negotiated. If this happens, you must first formally terminate negotiations before you begin negotiations with the next highest ranked consultant. It is important to understand you can only negotiate with one consultant at a time. Negotiations with another consultant should only occur after officially terminating negotiations with the prior firm. Once you have successfully negotiated a fair and reasonable compensation for the needed services, a contract can be executed in accordance with your state's required procedures. As with any contract, your role is to monitor the consultant's work throughout the life of the contract for quality and completeness. Additionally, consultant invoices must be reviewed to ensure the costs are consistent with the FAR cost principles, contract terms, and progress of the consultant's work. When the contract is completed, you are required to evaluate the consultant's performance of the scope of work items listed in the contract. You will use this information to assess a consultant's past performance if they compete for future federal aid work. All records pertaining to the consultant procurement and executed contract for services are required to be kept on file a minimum of 3 years following submittal of your final voucher to FHWA by your state DOT. You will find these helpful if asked to demonstrate compliance with all the requirements just covered. Under most circumstances, you must follow competitive negotiation procurement procedures for hiring a consultant to provide engineering and design-related services funded by federal aid. As defined within the Brooks Act, competitive negotiation requires you to select consultants based on qualifications and experience. Contract award occurs only after the negotiation of a fair and reasonable cost with the selected consultant. Your state DOT has the oversight responsibility for procuring and administering consultant services. Prior to contracting with a consultant when using federal aid funds, contact your state DOT for assistance to ensure you meet all federal and state laws and regulations that apply.
Now that you have watched this Federal Highway video on QBS, here is a brief recap on the process. You must advertise your RFQ for at least 14 days on the MoDOT website, and you may also place your RFQ in the newspaper. You must score and select the consultant based on qualifications as outlined in the video, and you must negotiate the work with the most qualified consultant who is on MoDOT's pre-qualification list. In the resources section of this training, we will show you where to find MoDOT's consultant pre-qualification list. Now that you have selected a consultant, you might have some further questions, such as, how do I develop an independent estimate? Or, how do I score a consultant that I have no prior history with? We encourage local agencies with these concerns to contact their surrounding cities or counties to see if they have any feedback or advice on these topics. We also encourage LPAs to check references on consultants and ask for examples of past work when they are scoring and trying to make a determination who best fits their project. We recommend LPAs ask their firms who will be the project manager. What is your firm's current workload? Can you deliver this project on my defined schedule? These types of questions will help the LPA in determining if the firm can deliver under their expectations. And as always, if you have questions, please contact your local MoDOT representative. While you are required to select the consultant based on who is most qualified to design the project, that does not mean you cannot negotiate the price of that firm's services once you have selected them. Negotiating the consultant contract is a very important step in hiring a consultant, and it can save your community money. The first step in negotiating a contract is to have a basic understanding of what's involved in designing and constructing your project. You will need to know what types of services you will need the consultant to perform, and have a general expectation of how long it should take to complete each task. Reviewing the hours in a contract can seem like a difficult task. However, even doing a gut check review of the hours is extremely beneficial. If you see an item of work that you feel may have too many hours assigned to it, simply ask the consultant to explain why there are so many hours for that task. You may also find that some higher paid management staff has hours on the project. You can simply ask the consultant what tasks those managers are going to perform, and you may find opportunities for those tasks to be performed by a different member of the team. Then again, you may not find any opportunities. The important thing to remember is, it never hurts to ask why. Look for opportunities to reduce travel time, mileage, etc. Perhaps by providing an office space for the consultant to work out of, you can cut the number of trips they would have to take to the project. This is just one example of trying to find win-win type situations to save everyone a little money. Be sure to compare the contract you are negotiating against other contracts you have completed. Keeping notes, ideas, and opportunities for saving money in a journal while each project is being completed makes comparing previous contracts really easy. Asking a neighboring community to help you out is always a good way to come up with money-saving ideas. For most projects, the consultant will be required to use the MoDOT Standard Contract for Consulting Services. Review this contract and familiarize yourself with the details. If you have questions, your MoDOT District LPA staff is always available to help you with questions. If you simply cannot come to an agreement on what you feel is a fair price, you are always able to formally terminate negotiations with the firm and begin negotiating with the next most qualified firm. It's important to note that once you cease negotiations with the firm and begin negotiating with another one, you cannot go back to the previous firm to restart negotiations. This would be considered price shopping, and it's not allowed. Now we are going to cover common errors in the consultant selection process. I should point out that most of these errors are found in the standard process or the QBS process. To reduce these errors and streamline the process is a big reason for introducing the on-call consultant list as part of the process has already been completed for the local agency. Now let's jump into the common errors. The first common error has to deal with scopes of service. Let's first discuss the scope of the RFQ or advertisement. This scope should be very broadly written to cover any scope the consultant might perform for the local agency. This is very important because if a task or scope item is left off the RFQ, the consultant cannot perform that task because this would be in violation of the Brooks Act, which states that the service must be advertised. Let's say the local agency wanted a consultant to design and inspect a particular project, and the scope item of inspection was unintentionally left off of the advertisement scope. Do you think the local agency could just negotiate this scope into the consultant's contract? The answer is no, because this scope was not advertised and would be in violation of federal law. In this case, the local agency would have to re-advertise for the scope item of inspection. So when creating the scope of the advertisement, remember it must be broadly written to cover any work the local agency thinks the consultant might perform for them under this contract. Next, let's visit the consultant contract scope. Now, this is just the opposite of the advertisement scope, in that this scope of the contract needs to be very tightly written. The local agency must sit down with the consultant and have each task identified with hours associated to complete each task. This tightly written scope covers both the local agency and the consultant in the event of adding or deleting scope in the contract. Another common error is missing information in the advertisement itself. One of the commonly missed items in the advertisement is the rating criteria that the local agency is going to use to score the consultants. Along with that, another missed item is the weighted values that go with each rating criteria. Bottom line here is remember to put each rating category along with its weighted value in the advertisement so the consultants know what they are being scored on when they submit their letters of interest. Rating and selecting consultants is another area that has been identified as a red flag for many states. Another common missed item is documentation on how the scores were determined by the individual raters. Written text identifying how the scores were determined is considered supporting documentation on the selection process and is required. Another red flag that stands out when reviewing the scoring sheets is that the winning consultant scored 100% in every category, as this indicates little or no thought was put into the scoring process and could result in the loss of federal funds. We often see local agencies that have selected the same firm for the past several years. That is okay, provided that the documentation represents that the firm is indeed the most qualified. However, we do encourage LPAs to try other firms from time to time to be able to compare the quality of each firm.
You have reached the end of Objective 2, starting your federal aid project. You will be required to take a short exam before moving on to the next objective.